In this video, I'm going to show you how to replace your inner tie rod on this Toyota Camry. If you need this or any other part, check us out at oneauto.com. Also, just so you know, after this job, you will need an alignment. Let's get started. If your vehicle has a locking lug nut, it should have one of these locking keys that goes on it. Find the correct slot, and I'm going to break this free by hand before I raise the vehicle up and use an air impact or electric on any of the other lug nuts. It is not recommended that you put an impact on that. So with a 21mm socket and a breaker bar, break this free. At this point, it is safe to put an impact on it because it's already broken free, and you basically just want to avoid the high force that the impact will put on this because it can break the little teeth internally. Now continue with your impact or tool of choice. 21mm socket, remove all the rest of your lug nuts. Remove your wheel. If it's stuck, give it a little tap. It should pop right off. Now with the wheel off, we need to break free this jam nut that secures the inner to the outer tie rod. I sprayed some rust penetrant on this, which hopefully will help once this breaks free. I have a 19mm wrench here that fits perfectly on this. And looking from the outside of the vehicle, so from the wheel side, I'm going to turn this clockwise to break this free because it's threaded this way. So if the wrench itself doesn't do the trick, you can use a rubber mallet on the end of it. Sometimes though, you can just tap it a few times by hand, but it looks like this one's pretty stiff. So I'm going to grab a rubber mallet and tap that wrench. Okay, looks like we need a little bit of heat also. There we go. All right, well that broke the inner free from the outer. The nut is still somewhat stuck on there, but at least these two are loose. I put some locking pliers nice and tight on here. I'm going to respray this with rust penetrant, and I'm going to try to break that nut free again off of the inner tie rod. The reason for that is because this jam nut has a flange here, and once we take the outer tie rod off, we cannot slide a socket over it to just take it off with an impact. That's usually what I would do, but I can't in this case. So instead of trying to fight it while this tie rod's loose in here, I'm going to take advantage of the fact that the outer is still connected and these are still threaded together to have some sort of securing point so I can put some leverage on this and hopefully at least snap it free off of these threads. Yep, that worked. So I have movement out of this jam nut, which is great. And the reason I went the other way at first is because we're gonna have to turn it counterclockwise to unthread it, and that's what I was aiming for. So this is somewhat broken free. These two are broken free. Now we can release the pliers, remove the outer tie rod from the knuckle, and continue. Next we have to remove the tie rod end here, and this cotter pin looks like it's a little rusty. I'm going to try to get it straightened out and push through, but if I can't, I'm going to have to cut it flush. Looks like it's not really working out in my favor here. That broke off flush. Use a 17mm socket. If you're doing it this way, you're going to have to tap the socket on with a hammer. Now tap the side of the knuckle here. That should pop the tie rod free from the knuckle. There we go. Now with the outer tie rod out of the knuckle, we have to count the amount of turns that it takes to take the outer tie rod out of the inner so that we can put it back the same amount of turns and be as close as possible to a decent alignment. Of course, you still need an alignment after this, but you want to get it close. Okay, 13 for me. That does not mean it's going to be the same for you. There's your inner tie rod. Now we have to get this jam nut completely off of here so we can slide the boot off. Okay, I clamped my locking pliers back on here so I can hopefully break this free. And now I'm just going to take my 19mm wrench and remove this nut, the jam nut, all the way off. And we have to do this because otherwise we can't take the boot off of the inner tie rod. I'm actually going to put the outer tie rod back on, and that will give me another secure point on this end so that this stops flopping around like that, and I will hopefully be able to take that mounting nut off. If I can't, then I have to just cut it, but I'd like to avoid that if possible. There we go, that's better. All right, looks like I got it to a point where it's not as stuck. So at this point I might be able to take that tie rod off and take it off with just the locking pliers on the inner tie rod. Let's take this back off again. And let's see if the jam nut, yep, it wants to come off now with just the locking pliers on here. It's still pretty stiff, but I'm gonna finish wrenching it the rest of the way off. There we go. Finally, take this off. And now I'm going to take my locking pliers off of here. Now grab some pliers and remove this clamp here. Just squeeze it and pull it off. Inspect this because if it's not in good condition anymore, you're going to want to replace it. Mine's okay, it's just a little rusty, so I'm going to reuse it. If yours is bad, you can either source a new one or just use a heavy-duty wire tie. That should work just fine. But if you can reuse it, I recommend reusing this one. If you look on the back side of the boot, you'll see that metal clamp there. We have to actually punch that off, and I'm going to use a pry bar and a hammer and just hammer it that way. If you have any cutters that'll get in there, you can just get in there and cut it. But a pry bar and a hammer will be the quickest way to get that out. Get your pry bar right on the clamp, make sure it doesn't slip and damage the boot. We are reusing the boot. Give it a tap. There we go, that popped off. These are single-use clamps, so you're gonna have to damage it somehow to get it off. Get the clamp off of there. Now you can grab onto the boot, pop it off, and remove it. Once you have the boot out, inspect it. If it has any damage, you're gonna wanna replace it because you'll get debris inside your power steering rack if that's the case. Mine looks good, so I'm going to reuse it. Also, make sure you have no fluid in it. If it's filled with fluid and there's fluid coming out of the rack over there, you have an issue with the power steering rack and you need to address that. This inner tie rod is greased up and somewhat contaminated, so I'm going to wipe it off, and looks like it's also rusty, so we may have had some water getting in here. There we go. And doing this will allow my tie rod tool to grip on better. Speaking of, this is the style of tie rod tool that I'm using. They make different styles and you can use whatever you have access to. You could even use a large wrench on that if you have that. Basically, this one that I have just clamps on, and then you can use a long extension with a breaker bar and break the tie rod free. The trick here is to make these nuts nice and tight so that it can clamp on and grip, otherwise it's just going to spin on that inner tie rod joint. Tighten these evenly. Now let's grab a breaker bar and a long extension, stick it in here, and break this free. There we go. Now with it broken free, I can remove my tool. Okay, get this out of here. And now you can remove the inner tie rod by just unthreading it. There it is. Wipe off the steering rack end here where the tie rod threads in, and check those threads, make sure they're good. Mine look like they're in perfect condition. So with this cleaned off, let's install the new tie rod in. Now take your new tie rod and thread it all the way in. Once it bottoms out, let's clamp on our tie rod tool and snug it up with that same breaker bar that we used to remove it with. Get this nice and tight on here. Get your tool in here, and when you tighten it, you just want to give it a quick snug. You don't want to twist that steering rack internally. So once it bottoms out like this, about 1/8 of a turn, that's good right there. It will lock into place. If you twist the steering rack, you can damage it internally. Remove your tool. Now remove your inner tie rod tool. This tie rod already comes with grease installed on the end of it, so I'm just going to take this end and work this grease back and forth. It's normal for it to be fairly stiff at the beginning. It's a brand new tie rod, and the joint has not operated much. With clean gloves, I'm going to try and squish that grease back in here. You just want to make sure you get an even coating all over that tie rod. With whatever grease is left on my hand, I like to put it right here where this notch is. That's where the boot clamps on the outer part of it. Putting grease here will prevent it from sticking in the future. Now take your boot, slide it over all the way in, and put it over the power steering rack, just like that. It should snap over and kind of lock in. But we do need to actually lock it in. I'm going to use a wire tie. If you don't have one of those metal clamps, this should be good. I have it already started here so that once I bring it over all the way in, it'll be easier to snug it up. Okay, I have it mostly tightened. However, I'm going to now take some needle nose pliers, and I'm just going to give that a quick spin so I can snug it up nice and tight. Okay, it'll break off once it gets tight. Over here, make sure that the boot is seated inside that groove. I can feel that it locked in. This is just some grease that it left behind, so I'm going to wipe this all off. It's important that this is seated properly so that water doesn't get in. That is actually why our tie rod was rusty. The boot was not seated all the way on this side, so water got in. Get that clamp back over and make sure it holds on tight. This is supposed to spin. That's why I also put grease in there, so that when the alignment is being done, the alignment professional can spin this tie rod without breaking the boot. So you don't want this stuck on here, but you don't want it popping off. That's what the goal is. Give it a tug to make sure it stays in place, and it does, so that's perfect. I have some anti-seize that I'm going to spray all over these threads. This will hopefully prevent what we had to fight at the beginning, which is the jam nut and the tie rod getting stuck. I'm not worried about getting it perfectly on all of the threads because now I'm going to put my new jam nut on, and what this is going to do is work it on all the threads as I spin this on. I'm going to bring it in all the way so I can get that anti-seize coating everything, and then I can back it off. I'm going to add some more anti-seize on this side. Now we can take the outer tie rod and put it on here. Count the amount of turns it takes to put it on, and for me it was 13. Like I said, for you it may not be the same, but that's what you want to aim for. Whatever number you had, count it. Okay, that's good right here for me. I'm going to bring this jam nut back in. Now take your tie rod, put it in through the knuckle. Make sure that stud goes all the way down. Move the knuckle if needed. Let's get that castle nut back on. If your cotter pin broke like mine did at the beginning, or you had to cut it, make sure you drill that out. Hopefully that is not the case for you though. Start this on by hand, snug it up. The torque for this is 36 foot-pounds. The trick here is that when you finish torquing it, you want that cotter pin slot to line up with the slot on the castle nut. If it does not, continue tightening, not loosening, to get it to line up. So technically I am torqued there, but I will check the slot and it does not line up. I have to keep going a little bit. A little bit more. All right, that's perfectly lined up for me right there. So I'm gonna get the cotter pin through, just like that, and leave a little bit of wiggle room in the cotter pin. If you make it nice and tight up against that castle nut, it is more likely to seize in place. If it can move around a little bit, it will not. So now take some pliers or whatever you have, and you wanna make sure you bend this cotter pin all the way up so that it is out of the way of anything that it may come in contact with, and you also want it to be locked in. There we go, just like that. That's tight. Now grab your wrench. This is now a 22mm nut, unless you reused your original one, which is fine to reuse if yours is in good condition. But 22mm for me. I'm going to snug this up. Make it nice and tight, and then I'm going to back it off so that the outer tie rod sits parallel with the knuckle, not at an angle. At this point, this is locked in, and I'm going to let the alignment professional do the rest from here. Once again, you do need an alignment after this job. Let's get the wheel back on. Put on all 5 of your lug nuts, bottom them out, and then we'll torque them in a cross pattern to 76 foot-pounds. Once again, 76 foot-pounds in a cross pattern. There you have it. Don't forget to get an alignment. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope it was helpful. If you have anything to say, leave it in the comment section below. And as always, don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell so you can stay up to date with all of our latest content. Thanks for watching.